Hello, and welcome to Top Story Daily Edition. I'm JNS Editor-in-Chief Jonathan Tobin. Thanks for joining me for another discussion on the most pressing issues in the Jewish world. Please like, subscribe, and give us good reviews when you listen to the show. Now let's get started. For the 1,000 black pastors who have joined a movement to pressure President Joe Biden to force a ceasefire in the war between Israel and Hamas, the issue is solidarity with the oppressed. This can be seen as part of a general revolt within the activist base of the Democratic Party against the administration's policy in the Middle East. Much like the petitions signed by lower-level officials throughout the government, Democratic congressional staffers, and even the president's campaign staff. But as reports in the New York Times, NPR, and other publications have made clear, opposition of black churches, which have been long key to get out the vote campaigns to elect Democrats, to elect Biden on an issue they say isn't marginal, poses a potentially lethal threat to his hopes for re-election. But the key question to be asked about this effort is not so much about its political impact, significant though it may be. It's why so many African Americans, especially church leaders who have real influence among their congregants, as well as the general black community, could come to believe that the cause of the Palestinians is somehow linked to their own interests and beliefs. The answer to this puzzle is clear. Intersectional myths, in which the Palestinian war to destroy the one Jewish state on the planet is somehow analogous to the struggle for civil rights in the United States, are no longer merely a talking point of academic fashion. These toxic ideas have now been embraced by the African American community. The teaching of critical race theory and the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, divides the world into two immutable groups, locked in a never-ending struggle, white oppressors and people of color, who are always the victims. Black pastors have swallowed the neo-Marxist lies that Jews are white oppressors and that Palestinian Arabs are victimized people of color, and are sharing that with their congregants. That the conflict in the Middle East isn't about race, Jews and Arabs are the same ethnicity, and that about half of Israeli Jews are themselves people of color because they trace their origins to the Middle East and North Africa, is left out of the discussion about American blacks' opposition to Israel. They seem equally ignorant or disinterested about the Palestinians' consistent rejection of every compromise offer, including those that would have granted them independence and statehood, provided they were willing to live peacefully alongside a Jewish state. That a ceasefire existed before October 7th, and that Gaza hadn't been occupied since 2005. Or that the Jews are the indigenous people in the place Americans call the Holy Land, is also omitted from these discussions. The facts about the Palestinian Arab century-long war against Zionism don't matter if you believe that any struggle can be reduced to an intersectional equation of evil whites, with the whites always being in the wrong no matter what either group does, and people of color. The language used by pastors in describing their campaign to bludgeon Biden, who knows all too well that he only won his party's presidential nomination in 2020, and then the general election that year because of black support, is not so much a reflection of political calculations as an attempt to frame their stand as an extension of civil rights advocacy. Barbara Williams Skinner of the North African American Clergy Network, a group that claims to represent 15 million black churchgoers, told the Times that black clergy have seen war, militarism, poverty, and racism all connected. But she said that anger directed at Israel exceeded any protests heard from her members about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. She asserted that the images of Palestinians set off the sort of deep-seated angst among black people that I have not seen since the civil rights movement. This was echoed by another pastor quoted in the Times. Quote, "We see them as part of us," said the Reverend Cynthia Hale, the founder and senior pastor of Ray of Hope Christian Church in Decatur, Georgia. They are oppressed people. We are oppressed people. Missing from these statements is any sense of context about the war. Also left out of the equation is what it is the oppressed Palestinians want, as well as how they are going about trying to obtain their objectives, and whether that has anything in common with the objectives of the civil rights movement. Indeed, the narrative of solidarity with the cause of the Palestinians has erased Israel, the rights of Israelis, their suffering, or their efforts to ensure that the atrocities of October 7th never be repeated. It also should extinguish the last vestiges of support for something that many once took for granted, the alliance between African Americans and Jews. When pressed for any acknowledgement of how the current war started or about Israel, the pastors say they are against terrorism and in favor of the release of the estimated 136 Israelis who continued to be held hostage in Gaza by Hamas. And they disclaim any connection with antisemitism. But the disconnect here is not on the side of Jews who are wondering how a group that they had resolutely supported has effectively abandoned them. Since the October 7th Hamas pogroms against communities in southern Israel, there has been an unprecedented surge of anti-Semitism in the United States. This shocking increase in open Jew hatred on the streets of American cities and college campuses, as well as in commentary in many mainstream outlets like The Times, is directly tied to efforts to demonize Israel and to treat its citizens and its American Jewish supporters as fair game for terrorism. Yet the very people that liberal Jewish groups have always worked closely with, black spiritual leaders, are so obsessed with their alleged common ground with Palestinians that they are completely ignoring the way their former friends are besieged by anti-Semitic incidents and hate speech. This is a shocking turnabout, especially when you consider how loyally legacy Jewish groups have stuck with the African American community, even as the evidence that the relationship wasn't reciprocal mounted. Organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee have endorsed the Black Lives Matter movement in spite of the fact that it was connected to and led by Jew haters. They also remain determined to support DEI policies, despite the way they provide a permission slip for anti-Semitism, something that has become obvious since October 7th, as colleges and universities failed to protect their Jewish students from the hate directed at them by anti-Israel mobs. The images that have pervaded the media about Palestinian suffering can explain some of the sympathy for their cause, but only if you don't consider why that suffering occurred or the practical alternatives. The population of Gaza has suffered terribly as a result of a war they started on October 7th with an orgy of mass murder, rape, torture, and kidnapping that they initially cheered as a great victory. Having sown the wind with terrorism, they then reaped the whirlwind, as Israeli forces began a systematic attempt to root out Hamas terrorists from their Gaza strongholds. The devastation has been great, as Hamas has dug itself into the Strip, building a tunnel network underneath homes, mosques, schools, and hospitals. Gazans didn't protest when billions in international aid money was diverted from humanitarian projects to turn the area into a subterranean fortress where terrorists can hide behind the civilians they deliberately expose to harm. The notion that Israel has no right to attack Gaza after October 7th is a novel theory of war. If terrorists are now granted the right to use populations as human shields while fighting a war, and after all, Hamas has shot more than 15,000 rockets and missiles at Israeli civilian targets since October 7th, then murderers will, in essence, be granted immunity for even the most barbaric crimes. And if a ceasefire is imposed on Israel before Hamas is eradicated, that's what will happen. At no point do black civil rights activists who believe the Palestinians' cause is no different from theirs acknowledge why Hamas started the fighting. They are explicit about the fact that they wish to destroy Israel and slaughter its population. And contrary to some of Biden's disingenuous statements about the issue, voting and polls have consistently shown that Hamas and its genocidal platform are widely supported by Palestinians. This suffering for the Palestinians began when Hamas launched its murderous attacks on Israel. It could have been ended at any point by Hamas's surrender and the freeing of all hostages. But Hamas and its allies don't care about Palestinian suffering. On the contrary, they wish to maximize it in order to garner more foreign sympathy. Black pastors claim to oppose the occupation without understanding that to the Palestinians, that term refers to any land that Israel controls. These clergy leaders may claim to oppose everything Hamas stands for, yet they support it because they have accepted the lie that the Jews are intrinsically evil by seeking to defend their homes and families. How does that differ from the American Civil Rights Movement? African Americans fighting against Jim Crow laws didn't seek to kill whites or establish a principle that blacks must rule, as the Islamists of Hamas do about Muslims. They wanted equal rights and an end to legal segregation. The goal of Martin Luther King Jr. was coexistence and a society where his children would be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. It is only in the upside-down world of intersectionality and critical race theory that turns that hope on its head that blacks, who claim to be the champions of civil rights, would consider a cause rooted in genocidal intent and intolerant of any notion of coexistence with other faith or ethnic groups as seeing themselves in the actions and the fate of the Palestinians. Shockingly, people like the black pastors who pretend to have moral authority would identify with a cause that would benefit the killers of Hamas. It's equally astonishing that they stand with the mobs chanting for the destruction of Israel from the river to the sea and terrorism against Jews wherever they live, globalize the Intifada, rather than with their former Jewish allies, as they suffer from prejudice and violence. But in this brave, new, intersectional world, that is what passes for civil rights advocacy in the black community. This is all the more disturbing when you realize that atrocities being carried out against black Africans in countries like Nigeria, Mauritania, or Sudan by Islamist forces, including mass killings, rape, and even a modern-day version of slavery, don't seem to interest these pastors or their congregations. Having gone through the intersectional looking glass, they are now prepared to ignore crimes committed against people with whom they ought to have a natural affinity, black Africans, because the perpetrators are Muslim or Arabs, while claiming to see Palestinians who want to slaughter Israelis as worthy not just of sympathy, but the expenditure of their political capital. It is long past time for the Jewish groups that have slavishly stuck to the pretense that these pastors and the organizations that they represent are allies to stop putting their heads in the sand. Those who enable antisemitism and wish to assist those who slaughter Jews are enemies, not friends. When it comes to support for Hamas, either tacit or not, and indifference to antisemitism, there is no middle ground. Black pastors who seek to demonize Israel and are silent about the Jew hatred that is inherent in their intersectional stands, embracing the cause of Israel's destruction, should be under no illusions about the choice they've made. For all of their high-flown rhetoric about compassion and the oppressed, these pastors are morally bankrupt. And American Jews who have long stood by their side in the struggle for civil rights should bluntly tell them that they are finished with such anti-Semites dressed in clerical garb. Thanks for listening. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition and every week for the full hour-long JNS TV program. Whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself.